Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Stephanie, for that warm introduction. I don't have a podium here, do I? No, that's fine. I can keep this in my hand. Yeah, so Pastor James asked me to talk a little bit on Christian myths about marriage. What a fitting conclusion to this talk on sex and singleness and marriage and relationships. I guess about an hour and a half ago, I was at home eating dinner with my family. You can put this picture of my family up. There they are. Me in the middle, like the paterfamilias, proud of my brood. About an hour and a half ago, we were eating dinner together, and I get up, and one of my kids asks me where I'm going, and I say I'm going to speak at UCM, which is this Christian club on campus. It's a great Christian club on campus. And then my wife says, "Oh, what are you talking on?" And then I kind of freeze. I'm like, "Oh." You see, if I say I'm talking on marriage, she's going to be like, "Well, you better not be talking about our marriage. And let me see your notes," right? She's going to want to vet what I'm saying. So I'm thinking fast. And what am I talking on? I repeat the question, which is always the first sign of being guilty, right? I said, "Well, you know, I'm talking about God and love." She said, "Oh, well, I hope it goes well. I'll see you at 9:30. So there's my first nugget of wisdom for you. A successful marriage, I've been married for almost 19 years, includes many small deceptions. No. I'm just kidding. I'm not lying to her. I wasn't lying to her. I am going to talk about God and love. Okay? In fact, this is my thesis, really. When we're talking about marriage and sex, we're talking foremost about God. You can bring up the slide, Alaric. Here's my thesis. I took this from an American theologian named Beth Felker Jones. And she's talking about sex specifically, but the book is about marriage. So I'll adapt this sentence. Marriage is about who God is, which means it's about the gospel story, okay? So before we're even talking about ourselves, our partners, whatever, we're talking about God. And I think this is really fundamental. And before getting into myths, I just want to kind of make it clear where I'm coming from. It's fundamental. It requires us to do a bit of a deep dive, however brief, into theology. Like what do we as Christians say when we're talking about God? And what we confess is that God is love, right? And what we mean by that in a theological sense is that God is eternally love. The Father loves the Son, and the Son loves the Father, and the love between them is the Holy Spirit. It's like a bond. This eternal love, this love giving between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit becomes then life-giving, because it's as if the love of God, the triune God, it pours out of him into the world. So everything that's been created, the world around us, and animals, and you and me, all this is created because of God's love. It pours out of him, out of this eternal communion, and his love becomes life-giving. And this love of God is pure, and it's intense. It's loyal, and it's costly. It's so costly. And then it becomes concrete in time and place, in what we call in the Bible a covenant. Have you heard this word before? A covenant. Covenant is where God binds himself in love to something. He binds himself in love to creation. He binds himself in love to you and to me and to anyone that comes in the compass of his love. Covenant, we can say, is like the context where love dwells, where God's love dwells. And it's interesting in the Bible that this covenant is often likened to a marriage. Some of you who know the Bible will have probably come across this, that God is often described as our spouse, and we're his wife, his spouse. And in fact, in older church traditions, like the one I grew up in, we would actually talk about marriage as a covenant. Like at a wedding, they would say, you're entering the covenant of marriage. Like they would kind of reinforce how our earthly marriages kind of reflect this divine marriage, this marriage between God and us, the seal of love. Like in the book of Chronicles, the cry goes out, Lord, there is no God like you in heaven or in earth, you who keep your covenant of love with us who love you. So marriage, sex is about who God is. And when we enter into marriage as husband and wife, we're entering into this communion of love that comes from God. We're sharing in his love, a love that is deep and loyal and costly and fierce. And then we become kind of the means by which this love flows from us, from God through us out into the world. Our human love, our human love-giving between husband and wife becomes life-giving, in fact, for the sake of the world. It does this by rescuing people from isolation, from brokenness. It becomes life-giving because it brings forth children and all sorts of good things that bless the world. So again, my thesis, marriage is about who God is, which means it's about the gospel. It's about the gospel story. So the problem is that Christians, willingly or unwillingly, we often end up teaching things about marriage, or maybe we could say we end up assuming things about marriage that aren't always consistent with who God is and with what the gospel is. And when we do this, when we perpetuate these assumptions, we end up harming people, we end up harming ourselves, and we end up belittling what it means to live in marriage. So we're calling these assumptions myths, right? Myths, Christian myths about marriage. Some of them are more serious than others, but I think each in its own way can obscure the beauty and the glory and the truth of who God is and what his covenant is like. So these are very serious, I think. They're myths that harm us, but they also diminish God's glory. So I think it's good to name them and identify them. This is what I want to do in just 15 minutes. I took 3 myths that I've come across. I'm not saying these are the most common ones. They're just ones I happen to know. And I'll identify them, and then we'll talk a little bit about how they impair how we're thinking about God. Okay? You can bring up the next slide. So this is myth number 1, that marriage is normal. And having brought you up to the heights of the love supreme, the Holy Trinity, I'm going to bring you crashing back down now, because I want to introduce this myth with a story, and it's a story about poop. So it's actually a story that involves poop. It's the worst first date story you've ever heard, okay? And every single word of it is true because it happened to my brother. So I know the story well. And my brother draws disasters to him like he's magnetic. So my brother, story happened about 20 years ago. My brother's older than me by 3 years. Met a girl and was smitten. He was infatuated, so he asked her out on a date. He lived in Vancouver at the time, and he thought a perfect place to go on a date if you live in Vancouver is Granville Island. Have you ever been to Granville Island? Like it's nice. Yeah, it's nice. If you haven't been there, it's the kind of place you can spend an afternoon wandering around. You know, there's the shops and boutiques and the ocean's there, and there's a microbrewery. It's a cool place. So he took his girl to Granville Island, and he found a great parking spot right on the edge of Granville Island. They walked in and were walking around, and he bought her from one of these street vendors this kind of paper sleeve of, you know these little donuts you get that are powdered and nicely freshly deep fried, and they smell good and they're sugary. And he bought her this sort of sleeve of them, and they were walking around, and then a seagull flew overhead, and it pooped in her hair. And she's horrified, he's mortified, and he thinks, I can help this. So he's got a couple of donuts left. He throws them in the garbage, and he's got his paper sleeve, and he thinks he can sop it up. But what he didn't realize is that the paper's waxed, right? So it doesn't sop up, it doesn't soak up the feces. It actually spreads it into her hair and into her scalp. So she's just horrified. This is their first date, right? She's just horrified, and she's like, date's over. Please take me home. So he's, okay, let's go back to the car. The story gets worse. As they get close to the car, my brother sees his car on the end of a tow truck. And he parked in a place that was not only illegal, but it's where you get your car impounded. This is why this great parking spot right by Granville Island was empty. And he's not able to talk the tow truck driver out of the ticket. So the car's impounded, and it disappears. And then my brother's like, shoot, I guess we've got to take a taxi and go after the car. What he didn't realize is that his wallet with his credit card was in the car. He had actually just had cash on him. And all he'd had after buying these donuts was a little bit of cash. So the story continues with them on the bus, city bus, going to Richmond, about 15 kilometers away, to recover his car. And several hours later, and about $300 in fines later, he drops this girl off at her house. Worst first date ever? If you can beat that, come and talk to me afterwards. But I would almost, if I was a betting man, again, every word is true. Now, the really funny thing about this story is that I think it was 21 months later, I'm flying into Vancouver from Montreal to be the best man at their wedding. Not bad, hey? Now, my sister-in-law, at the wedding, she forbade talk of what she calls the seagull story. And to this day, we do not mention it around her. But as you can imagine, at the bachelor party, my brother and I were having a glass of scotch, and of course I'm going to bring it up. So we're talking about it, and his friends are laughing about it, and inevitably we start talking about how their marriage is clearly this God thing. And like, how could it not? After this epic first date fail, God had brought them together. Really a miracle that she gave him a second chance, right? I remember one of my brother's friends saying something like, man, God has totally called you together. He's called you to her, and nothing on earth or in hell or in the skies above could prevent this thing from happening. And it's a beautiful thought, and it makes me think. I've heard this often at weddings. People express something like God must have brought you together. It can be a bit of a cliche, but there's actually some truth to it. I think that God brings people together, and when we strip away the sentimentality and the cliche, the truth is God is calling us into marriage. And my whole long story is building to this point. Just in an extreme way, my brother and his wife were called together, and that's the truth of it. Marriage is a calling. Now, God is free, and his plan and his purpose are good. They're always good, and his call to marriage is good, but it's free. It's God's choice. It's God's calling. So the myth that marriage is normal is dangerous for us because we underestimate God's freedom, that God calls us, and we default to this idea that marriage is normal in the sense that it's kind of inevitable, like we have a right to it. This is what we inevitably will do, that we all will happen this way. Marriage is, however, a calling. It's a divine calling, and it's God's prerogative. Marriage isn't normal. It's common, like a lot of people get married, but it's not normal in the sense that it's inevitable. It's not a default position. God calls us into it. And in extreme cases, like with my brother, we can only just marvel at the miracle of this calling. But to treat it as normal is to diminish, I think, the significance of marriage as a calling, as a peculiar calling. And as Josh and Sam said so well last week when they were talking, when we think marriage is normal, and if you don't end up married, well, what does that make you? Not normal, right? Like there's something wrong with you. And that's a false view too. So marriage is a calling from God, and it's not a default. We can never think of it as the kind of normal, as the status quo for all of us, even if it is common. You can bring up the next slide, Alaric. Here's a deep thought for you. I took this from the late Pope, so you know it's a deep thought. Creating the human race in his own image and continually keeping it in being, God inscribed in the humanity of man and woman the vocation and thus the capacity and responsibility of love and communion. It's a deep thought. We can't parse it all here, but I wanted just to draw your attention to this idea of vocation. That vocation literally is a calling. And what Pope John Paul is saying, and he's summarizing biblical and Christian wisdom, is that to be a sexual being, to be a person made in God's image, is a calling. And this calling isn't a default. It's not a status quo. It's something that God particularly calls us to. And it takes two forms. We're called either to be faithfully single or to be faithfully married. But both of these callings reflect who God is, what the gospel is, and what God wants us to be. Both of these callings are ways that the triune love, the love of God in himself, is poured out into the world through us. Now, the Christian church is sometimes debated. There's been never unanimity about which calling is better. In the Roman Catholic Church, the call to being single has often been considered a higher calling. In the Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox and Protestant churches, the call to be married and the call to be single are kind of on the same level. They're both equal and important callings. But however we parse it, the whole Christian church is agreed that there are these two callings, ways of being faithful to who God is. And neither of them are normal in the sense that we can think it's normal to be single, like it's the default, or it's normal to be married. They're both specific and peculiar callings. Jesus talks about this a little bit too, and you can bring up the next slide, Alaric. Oh, okay, don't, because that's... Go back. I thought I put this Bible verse on the slide, but I didn't. It comes from the Gospel of Matthew, and Jesus is being quizzed by people about divorce, and he gives this very hard answer that people shouldn't get divorced, that marriage is kind of for keeps, with very limited exceptions. And the people are shocked, and they say, how can this be? Who can be married then? Let me find the text in my notes here. His disciples say, not everyone, if this is the case, it's better not to marry, they say. And then Jesus says, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. So there's this calling to life. And then he raises the other issue of being faithfully single. He says some people are eunuchs, so he's using this older idea of being celibate. Some are eunuchs by birth, and some are eunuchs by choice. They're eunuchs for the kingdom. It's also difficult. So these two paths lie before us: one of being faithfully single, the other of being faithfully married, and they're both callings. So I think it follows from this, just to reinforce something important that Josh and Sam said last week, that if you're single right now, and I think most of you probably are, can I presume that? I think so. Most of you are probably single. It's not like you've defaulted, right? This is actually a calling from God right now on you to be single. And then the question is, how am I to be faithfully single? What does this mean in the here and now as a student? And for the few of us here who are married, a couple of us, just a couple, this is a calling too. And then the challenge for us is, how are we to be faithfully single in this calling, in this moment right now? But both of these things are vocations. Then I think one last thing I wanted to say just about marriage and the idea that it's normal, this myth. I think one thing that follows from this is when we think about marriage as normal, I think an additional problem that sometimes emerges is that it becomes very, very easy to think that there's a kind of normal time to get married too. And I don't want to go into great detail here, but certainly in some cultures and in some churches, there's this assumption that a normal marriage looks this way, right? And maybe like really young, right out of high school, whatever. And I think that also doesn't respect God's freedom, that the God who calls us into marriage calls us in very different ways. And we always want to be attentive to his divine call. Some of us may be called very young into marriage. Others might be called into marriage very late. And they're both okay. It's not like one is normal. So getting rid of this myth of normalcy in marriage, I think, is important. So the second thing I wanted to say in terms of myths is that marriage is easy. Now, I have no idea how this myth persists, but it does. And I'm constantly surprised by it because you all know that relationships aren't easy, right? Some of you probably wish you could kill your roommate sometime. I mean, that's just a roommate relationship. Those of you who have boyfriends and girlfriends, you know relationships aren't easy. And a lot of you have grown up in broken homes, or you've watched your parents' marriage disintegrate. You know this isn't easy. And yet, I come across this myth frequently that marriage is somehow easy. It's hard for everybody else, but my marriage is going to be different. It's going to be easy. God's going to make it work. He's going to bless me with a wonderful spouse and a good marriage and good kids, etc., etc. No. This is a myth that is sometimes quite tempting, I think, if you've grown up in a church that has rightfully encouraged you to not be sexually active before you're married. Sometimes what's implied, though, is that if you are abstinent before marriage, you kind of get rewarded, right, with a really good marriage and, of course, with great sex. And both of these things are patently false, all right? There's no cause and effect here. You don't get a payoff by doing the right thing in the here and now. Hate to break it to you if you were thinking along these lines. It doesn't work that way. Great sex in marriage is not a reward. It comes from a lot of work often and growing in trust and in intimacy. Now, it is interesting that studies of sexual satisfaction often show that married people have the highest rates of sexual satisfaction. But interestingly, it's often specific to married people who are middle-aged, like your parents' age. I just made you think about your parents having sex, eh? Oh, you're like, oh, gross. I really wanted to do that just to mess with you. But it kind of makes sense, though. We've had years of growing into each other, of getting to know each other, of becoming deeper and deeper in love and in intimacy. And all this is work. This is work. It's good work, but it's work. Don't ever think about marriage as being easy, and certainly not as some kind of reward we get for being faithful to God. One of my heroes, who's a man named Martin Luther, who is this great church leader and reformer 500 years ago. He was single for many, many years, for over half his life, actually. And then he got married in his late 40s. And he had a very happy marriage. He adored his wife. And she was, by all accounts, just a perfect match for him. So, a wonderful, joyful marriage. But he wrote in his table talk, "Marriage is a hazardous matter and as serious as anything on earth can be." I love that when I read that. Marriage is a hazardous matter. And he adored his wife and had a good marriage with lots of joy and an enormous amount of laughter. But the hazards of marriage are manifold. They're exterior, like circumstances and personalities and the events of life. But there's a hazard in marriage that's actually just inbuilt into it. I think God, in many ways, has designed marriage to not be easy. It's because It's about covenant love. And covenant love is never sentimental or soft. Can you bring up the next slide, Alaric? This is from this great love poem that's right in the middle of our Bible that we never read, the Song of Songs. Place me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death. Its jealousy, unyielding as the grave. It burns like blazing fire, like a mighty flame. Many waters cannot quench love. Rivers cannot sweep it away. This is poetic, but it's not sentimental. This is a love that's strong. It's jealous in the right way. It's as true as steel, and it's burning like fire. This is the kind of love, the covenant love that God has for his creation, for his world. A love that is as strong as the death of Jesus Christ. A love that is jealous to the grave, that will see us resurrected on the last day. A love that is a blazing flame, like when the Holy Spirit came down at Pentecost in the New Testament and tongues of fire burned over every follower of Jesus Christ. This is the love of the covenant that gets embodied and reflected in a human marriage. This is a love that is intense, and it's the primary place. Marriage is a primary place where this love is at work in us to make us more and more like Jesus Christ. So marriage by design is not meant to get us off easy. It can be wonderful, it's good, it often is good, and sometimes it's very good, but there's a hazard to it too. There's an intensity about it. This is where God is at work in this covenant relationship, making us into his people. I came across this reflection a couple of years ago by an ethicist that I wanted to share with you. You can bring up the next slide, Alaric. I hope this isn't too abstract. This is an ethicist reflecting on the gift of marriage and identifying for him, in the context of a covenant marriage, this gift of time. And it's the time that I like connecting this idea of time with the effort that's required in marriage, the kind of work that's involved that makes it not easy. And Mailander writes this: the great gift marriage offers a husband and wife in their companionship is time. Time to work out the meaning of their life together. Time to take up with seriousness and joy the task of loving one who, beginning with the obvious biological difference inscribed in their bodies, is so different, so other than oneself. Time for God to train them in the meaning of holiness. After almost 19 years of marriage, this thought means a lot to me. Like 19 years it's a long time. It's almost most of your lifetime, right? Of being with one person and having God at work in us. Someone who is so different from me, and I thought she was different when we got married. After 19 years, we're even more different, right? And yet we've grown closer together too. Time for God working his way in us through this intense, passionate love that is stronger than death, love that is jealous to the grave, training us up to be holy, to be the kind of people God wants us to be. This is the covenant context of marriage. This last summer, my family and I were visiting my wife's family in Germany. My wife is a German citizen and grew up there. And we visited her aunt, who lives in Cologne in Germany. And her aunt is just retired as the resident historian of the Cologne Cathedral, which is this picture here, which is one of Europe's great churches. And her aunt gave us this personal, private tour of the cathedral, which was just awesome. You have to imagine, she has this ring of keys that probably weighed about 3 kilograms, and it opens every door, everywhere in this 14th century cathedral. It was amazing. My kids were just in awe. I was too. I was just squirming the whole time with excitement because I'm a history nerd that way. And we went down to the vaults, and then just to the side of the vault, there were these workmen who were working, cleaning. They were repairing gargoyles, which is so cool. They had this little tiny rasp and a little, almost like a toothbrush. They're just working away on it. And my wife's aunt says, "Man braucht unglaublich viel Zeit dafür." One needs an incredible amount of time. But they're cleaning, they're taking off all the air pollution. They're scouring these rocks so that the master's craftsmanship from the Middle Ages can shine through again. Time. It takes incredible amounts of time. And something similar is going on in marriage, in Christian marriage, that God is giving us the gift of time to, start rasping away at us, making us into the people that he wants us to be, bringing his handiwork, his craftsmanship to light from all that might obscure it. And there's nothing easy about this. There's nothing sentimental about this. Marriage is very good, but it's not easy. Beth Felker-Jones, who I quoted earlier in the same book, she reminds us, God calls us to love our enemies. And we learn how to do that, first of all, in marriage. My wife found that really funny when I read that out to her. It sounds shocking at first, though, right? God calls us to love our enemies, and we learn how to do that in marriage, first of all. It's not, she's being a bit tongue-in-cheek, but just a bit. There's biblical precedent for what she's thinking. When we were still enemies, God loved us. This covenant of marriage in the Bible between God and his people is where enemies become lovers and friends. And this heavenly reflection on earth in marriage is where people who are very different, maybe we're not enemies, but people who are very different learn to be one person, where we work together in tandem. Here's my last myth. Marriage is enough. You can bring up the slide, Alaric. Marriage is enough. I think everything I'm going to say about this myth, I think if you're in any kind of committed relationship, this probably would apply to you too. This is a myth I've encountered this quite a bit in the church, not in young people getting married as much as observing my peers, that marriage is enough. And it's not articulated as much as it's implied. Let me tell you what I mean. If we think about marriage as a kind of goal, as an end, once you've achieved it, you've got it, right? You've arrived. You're there. You've got the crown, the victory. You've got what you wanted. When we think about marriage that way, we're often our relationships become quite claustrophobic. We kind of withdraw in on ourselves. You know what I mean? Have you come across these relationships before, maybe in older couples, or even if you have friends who are totally into each other? It's just like they've kind of sucked into each other and nothing else exists. You've probably come across relationships like that. Hopefully you're not in one, but many of us have come across it. We perpetuate this sometimes in the church when we elevate marriage to be the be-all and end-all of everything. It's the crown. And if you get it, you've achieved the victory and you don't need anything else. I think it's a serious mistake, though, and it creeps up on us, this kind of thinking. It's a serious mistake, and it devalues what marriage really is, because it devalues who God is and what the gospel is all about. God's love, the love of the triune God, is life-giving. And when his love is given between friendships, between a husband and a wife, that love too needs to be life-giving. It needs to flow outside that relationship, outside that marriage. to the good of the world, to the good of the community, the people around us. And only then does a marriage really share in the gospel. Is it part of God's mission to the world, to bless the world? God loved the world so much that he gave his only son, and whoever believes in him has eternal life. Like there's this connection between love giving and life giving. That's the eternal covenant, God's love. And we want to see that reflected in our human marriages as well. I was thinking about this when I was reading through the Song of Songs, which is, again, not a book we often read. But there's so many instances where this relationship, and it's between a white man and a black woman who are passionately in love with each other. There's so many instances in this strange book where they're full of ardor and they're talking about how each other is incredibly beautiful and they love each other. And then they call their friends to witness it. It's just stunning. They're like, come and join us. Come and join our feast. We've got a banquet. There's this one line I pulled out when I was reading it. Eat, friends, drink, and be drunk with love. You can't believe that's in the Bible. Be drunk with love. And like the love we have is intoxicating and it's spilling out around us, making other people drunk. It's just a beautiful way of expressing this divine love, bubbling up, spilling out over into the relationships around us. And this is really love-giving that becomes life-giving. When we enter into marriage as Christians, so we believe, so the church believes, we're entering into something much bigger than us, and it's designed to bless the world, not just bless each other. Josh and Samantha last week mentioned, they listed a number of famous Christians who were single, which I thought was a great idea, and they listed one whose name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian, mid-20th century, and he was single in a technical sense. He was engaged and was then put in jail and then was executed in jail. So he never was married, although he was intending to be. And we actually have his correspondence between himself and his fiancée, Maria von Wedemeyer, and it's very poignant reading, as you can imagine, because you kind of know what happens to him and to them. You can bring up the next slide, Alaric. When he's in jail, he's asked by his best friend to give a wedding sermon, and he's not allowed to marry them because he's in jail as a political prisoner of the Nazis. But he writes the sermon and then has someone read it at their wedding. And there's this one line in it I wanted to draw your attention to. Now, just to make my talk come full circle, I first heard this quotation at none other than my brother's wedding, the one of the seagull fame. And the minister who married them said this, quoting from Bonhoeffer's Letters and Papers from Prison: "Marriage is more than your love for each other. It is a higher dignity and power, for it's God's holy institution through which God wishes to preserve humanity unto the end of time. As God is higher than human beings, so marriage is higher than us." This is the line I love. "It is not your love that upholds marriage, but from now on, it is marriage that upholds your love." We're entering into something big and holy in this covenant. And whatever affections we might feel at the beginning, they will wane. Sometimes they will fluctuate always. They'll ebb and flow. But our marriage is no longer upheld by the emotions we feel for each other. The marriage itself is what's upholding our love. It's a remarkable thought and a great reminder that when Christians enter into marriage, we're entering into something that is meant to bless the world. When you enter into relationships, even before marriage, you're entering into something that God wants to use to bless the whole world. And there's different ways that this love giving between lovers, between spouses, between friends becomes life-giving. In marriage, obviously, having kids is one important aspect of this. And without going into great detail, it does concern me in our society right now how many young married couples are turning their back on having kids, and as a lifestyle choice, right? Kids are a blessing from God. We have no right to them, There are circumstances where marriages will not be blessed with kids, and there are times when a married couple who are Christian may not want to have kids. There sometimes are good reasons for that. But most of the time, marriages are going to flow out in love, having kids. And when in our wider culture, to have a child right now can seem kind of countercultural. But when we're having kids, we're expressing hope, right? Hope in God's good future. And we are expressing God's love, a love which flows out through us to bless the world. Kids are an important part of a marriage in terms of how love-giving becomes life-giving. But there are lots of other ways too. Lots of other ways too, as wide as your imagination, really. Some couples I know, they just have a crowded table. Like people are allowed to just join them for meals after church. I know couples in my church who are retired and their kids have grown up and they keep fostering babies. Like their love is flowing out through them to the world. My wife and I have tried to be very deliberate about this. Every year we've been married, we've had at least one stray kid living with us between the ages of 17 and 25, sometimes more. There's always someone in our house, and that's not for everybody. We always have room for it. We have capacity. But for us, it's just a way of expressing that our marriage is not to be claustrophobic. Our house is not to be claustrophobic. I think if you're in a relationship right now and you're not married, you can start thinking along these ways, though. Like ask yourself, if you're in a deep friendship or a deep romantic relationship, how is our relationship blessing the world? It's not just good for me and you. How is it good for them out there? And this is the kind of question we ask to start us on the road to thinking about how marriage reflects God and his gospel. So I think I'm going to wrap it up there. It's getting late and I've talked enough, and we could go on and on and on. But maybe take a couple minutes and look at these 3 questions and break into groups of 4 to 6? Does that work? Yeah? Got the thumbs up, 4 to 6. And try to answer all these questions or one of them, whatever grabs your attention. All right? And if anything I said has upset you or offended you, please come and talk to me afterwards. I always like talking about these things. So go ahead, break into groups and reflect a little bit.